There have been absolutely no good movies this year. CGI has ruined cinema. Movies used to be creative and original, now they are just sequels and remakes with forced politics. Well, one thing is certain, there is no originality in any of these statements. Ever since my brain started growing and manifesting cinephilic tendencies, I have been recognizing a pattern of attitudes toward modern movies. A notion that each passing year is a disgrace to cinema and that films have become empty shells of their former glory. First off, what do we mean by modern cinema? How many years have to elapse for a movie to stop being modern and become old or classic? 5 years? A decade? A semi-century? Some consider Jaws to be the starting point of this era because of how much it shifted the blockbuster landscape. But I highly doubt that these common complaints are referring to movies from the late 70s or 80s. So, since there is no solid definition for modern cinema, and for the sake of this argument, I will categorize movies from the year 2000 onwards as modern. After all, it was during the 2000s that studios and filmmakers started embracing the use of CGI, and superhero movies became more popular than ever, and according to some, these two factors signaled the death of cinema. We tend to paint a romanticized picture of the past, a picture we use to distract ourselves from the present and the future. Because it's comforting to look at, it's not tainted by any concerns or anxieties, it's just over. We don't need to do anything about it, we need only to look and rejoice in it. This is particularly true when looking at art and media. People always think that classic music is the best, that real artists are long gone, and of course that older movies are better. Two processes take place inside the brain that lead to this perception of the past: manipulation and filtration. Our brains manipulate and create their own versions of things that we have experienced. There are so many bad and mediocre movies that people, including me, remember so fondly, because more often than not, we don't recall the quality of the movie, we recall the experience. And watching a movie is usually a relaxing, positive experience. Even if the movie is bad, it's still entertainment, which makes for a good memory, especially if it's associated with happier times like childhood or a relationship. In addition to that, there is the sense of wonder that we get from consuming a certain type of media that we haven't been exposed to before. For instance, our first horror movie will probably always be one of our favorites in that genre, while a recent horror movie may not seem very special because it cannot compete with that thrill that we got from our first experience, even if the new one is superior in every aspect. Our opinions of older movies are adorned with the comfort and wonder of those experiences, which upon a rewatch may be changed or further validated depending on how strongly we associate those movies with fond memories. But does that mean that all classic films are not as good as we remember them?
No!
Of course not. The point that I am trying to emphasize is that every decade has its share of good and bad. And since the rise of this industry, I don't believe there was ever a time that suffered a shortage of good movies. Countless beloved classics have aged very well and earned their status, and it's true that when we think about the best movies ever made, it's easier to name older films. But this is largely due to the other process, the filtration. We have a clear idea about the best films that came out in the 80s, for instance, because over the years, bad and mediocre films have been filtered out through critics, media, and audiences' memory. So what we remember and revisit now are usually the cream of the crop, which weren't necessarily recognized as so upon their release. Let's take a look at The Thing, for example, a film considered to be one of the best horror movies ever made with its unique concept, foreboding atmosphere, and mind-blowing special effects. Upon its release in 1982, it flopped at the box office and it was aggressively attacked by critics because, from their perspective, the film is lacking in characterization, is needlessly dark and graphic, and doesn't measure up against superior older films like Alien, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and The Thing from Another World, which is based on the same source material. It wasn't appreciated until its release on video and TV, and it found its audience gradually over the years. Now, it is being used as a reference point by some to overstate how terrible the special effects in new horror movies are, which in hindsight makes the initial comparisons to older movies pretty ironic. Blade Runner, released the same year, also underperformed at the box office and was met with criticisms against its slow pace and lack of a straightforward narrative. Now, it is celebrated as one of the most influential science fiction films ever made. Of course, I'm not suggesting that every single classic was not appreciated at the time. There are numerous successful and critically acclaimed films that are still highly regarded by both audiences and critics. What I'm indicating is that time sieves bad and forgettable movies from our memories, even if they were hits upon their release. And that's one of the main reasons why we remember the good stuff when we think about the old days. Contrast this with how we survey current movies. Through streaming services and different media platforms, we have access to a huge amount of content, irrespective of quality. And we only need to scroll through our phones to hear about the latest flop, read a bunch of funny negative reviews, and laugh at cynical major studios' decisions. Consequently, the present-day landscape usually seems gloomier because we are more exposed to the negative content that is still yet to be sieved from our memories. Many of the complaints about the lack of good original movies are accompanied by comments about the prevalence of sequels, remakes, and superhero movies, the overuse of CGI, and the forced infusion of politics. No, I'm not gonna use the W word, I refuse to. These are all valid complaints against certain types of movies. If all we're consuming is mainstream manufactured media, then yeah, most modern movies would seem shallow, uninspired, and derivative, because that is what we are looking for. If we challenge ourselves and spend a small amount of effort looking for movies outside the most accessible, standardized content, then I guarantee we can find plenty of powerful and innovative works, some of which will be remembered and celebrated in years to come. I usually can find at least 15 great movies per year, with one or two to add to my favorites of all time. A few examples from just the past 10 years are Arrival, Roma, and Tar. There are a lot of original stories being told and unique voices being expressed in international and independent cinema that we can discover rather than wait for the next Parasite to blow up and become a global phenomenon. And to be clear, this is not me saying independent movies equals good, mainstream movies equals bad. There are loads of terrible independent movies, and there are so many great mainstream ones, including comic book adaptations. My point is that cinema is too broad to be defined by a single brand of movies. Now you may ask, why do we have to search for good original movies? Didn't we used to just know when a good movie is on? This brings us back to my point about filtration. New movies, especially from the last 5 to 10 years, haven't been completely filtered yet. Therefore, it may be more difficult for the casual moviegoers to find what appeals to their taste, especially when considering that the production rate is much higher than it used to be. According to the Numbers website database, about 2,400 movies were released between 1995 and 1999, compared to 20,000 movies between 2015 and 2019. That's almost tenfold higher. I'm not sure how accurate these numbers are, but they draw a rough figure of the growth in movie production during the last couple of decades, which made it slower and more difficult to filter out the bad stuff. You may say that good movies were easier to find because they were commercially successful and everyone heard about them, and I agree with that to a certain extent. If we go back to 1982 again and look at the top 10 highest grossing movies from that year, we'll see a healthy variety of original movies with only 2 sequels in there. Jump 40 years forward and we have 9 sequels and 1 reboot in the top 10 highest grossing movies. Admittedly, a sharp contrast there, but I have a few things to clarify. First of all, not every sequel, remake, and reboot is bad. There are some amazing movies, new and old, that are follow-ups to other existing material. Besides, sequels, remakes, and reboots have always existed. Some of the most popular horror movies from the 70s and 80s are remakes. A Star is Born has been remade 3 times excluding the new one. The original Planet of the Apes spawned 4 sequels, Jaws spawned 3 sequels, The Godfather spawned 2 sequels, even 2001 A Space Odyssey has a sequel. Who thought it was a good idea to follow that with this? Contrary to popular belief, original movies with original ideas are still constantly coming out. They're just not typically the most popular movies of each year. The way I see it, that's not a problem with modern cinema, that's a problem with modern audiences. The market seems stuck in this awkward situation where conventional movies are not satisfactory and experimental movies are not tolerated. There is definitely a demand for originality and innovation. But what do those two words mean within the context of storytelling? Modern movies are put under a microscope when they are being judged for originality. If a movie presents a group of senior satanic cultists attempting to resurrect a demon, then it's obviously ripping off Rosemary's Baby. If a movie explores the dynamic of a couple going through divorce, then it's obviously ripping off Kramer vs. Kramer. I think this is an unfair way to evaluate a movie's originality. We have to keep in mind that for over a century, hundreds of thousands of movies and TV shows have exhausted countless ideas, story structures, and filmmaking techniques. So much so that coming up with a concept that is 100% original is almost impossible. No matter how inventive today's filmmakers may be, they are bound to step into familiar territories when creating their work. That doesn't mean they have no choice but to copy and rehash older works. Good modern movies can blend past inventions and build upon them to produce their own innovation. If we take a look at Anatomy of a Fall, my favorite movie from last year, we'll see that the basic premise is that of a typical courtroom drama, which is a subgenre often criticized for being stale and repetitive. But Anatomy of a Fall broke the mold by interweaving the whodunit scenario with commentary about relationships and perspectives. The result is a unique exploration of the truth and people's interpretation of the truth. Unfortunately, sometimes movies are misunderstood and heavily criticized for trying something new. A recent example is Jordan Peele's Nope, which uses the creature feature premise as the groundwork for a story about humans' obsession with fame and spectacle. I agree that it's not a perfect movie, and I agree that in some parts the message overshadows the story. But I applaud the movie's willingness to take risks and innovate, and I don't think it deserves to be hated or labeled as pretentious for venturing beyond the audience's expectations. We can't demand creativity and innovation without tolerating some level of experimentation. If a movie can't experiment without risking a tough backlash, then we shouldn't be surprised when studios prefer to play it safe. We have to realize that when we watch a movie, we are basically voting with our wallets, and nowadays, that applies to both theaters and TV. Studios and streaming services will always follow the money. They will invest in and promote projects that are more likely to turn a profit, so if we really want more original movies, maybe we should try to manage our addiction to recognizable formulas and IPs, which funnily enough, is fairly similar to our fixation with old media. They are both rooted in our preference for the safe and familiar, and they both avert our interest in the new and daring. In any case, I don't think a movie's quality should be gauged by how much money it made. I'm pretty confident that Blade Runner is held in higher regard than Porky's. And finding smaller, less popular movies isn't really that much of a hassle in this day and age. If one would argue that we didn't need to look for good movies in the past, I would say it's very easy to do so now. With this crazy thing called the internet, we have access to numerous media platforms through which we can learn anything we want about a certain movie and the people who made it. Unfortunately, this is already happening to a limited extent. I criticized modern audiences' affinity toward recognizable IPs, but I also love that some audience groups are following and supporting certain filmmakers like Christopher Nolan, Quentin Tarantino, and Wes Anderson, to name a few. I don't believe that was a common thing among casual moviegoers in the past, and I hope more filmmakers will get this kind of exposure in years to come. Cinema is an ever-changing industry. Films are never in a static place. Concepts are always emerging, techniques are always developing, quality standards are always shifting, and storytelling boundaries are always being pushed. Rather than adapting to these changes, people often stubbornly cling to the past, to this preconceived idea of how stories should be told, what emotions they should evoke, what films should look and sound like, and even how they should be made. Talkies were considered a passing fad until people realized that hearing characters speak is much more engaging than reading intertitles. Theatrical performances were preferred for being more expressive until naturalism grounded films and arguably made them more relatable. And to this day, CGI is frowned upon and considered inferior to practical effects, when in reality, both types of special effects can be great and both can be bad. CGI is an amazing tool that helped create iconic fictional worlds and, speaking of the past, recreate older times seamlessly. Now, if classic storytelling, theatrical performances, and retro technology are simply your preferences, then who am I to tell you otherwise? My point isn't that we can't prefer older movies, but that we shouldn't dismiss new ones based on some popular bad examples. If we allow new filmmakers to create and experiment, and if we give modern movies a fair chance regardless of their scale and popularity, we would realize that cinema is not dead, it's just changing, like it always has. What do you guys think? Do we have a shortage of good movies? Is cinema on the decline? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring the bell, and I'll see you next time.